in cities where all economic activities, except the purchase of goods and services, are carried out by women. Good luck to all the teams, and Prime Minister, you're welcome.
Before we start, leadership.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We are very proud to propose a motion that recognises that under the status quo, effort after effort has failed to do anything substantial about the glaring inequality between men and women in both the developed and developing world. A world in which 90% of property continues to be owned by men, in which the Forbes Top 100 continues to be dominated overwhelmingly by men, but perhaps most importantly, a world in which at the very lowest income bracket, it is women overwhelmingly who are discriminated against and left to the fate of life and insecurity and discrimination and violence in their own home. We propose a model in which, in both the developed and developing world, because we think that we are tired of a trope that says that discrimination against women is something that is exclusive to the developing world. It is just not true, and we are quite happy to debate in both those worlds. We are happy in both those worlds to argue for special economic zones, a model which has already been used in the past. This is a model in which we say to businesses, if you invest in this area, you will get tax cuts, you will get preferences on tariffs. We will do everything it takes to make it a lower transaction cost for you to invest in this city, to hire in this city, and to work in this city. These are policies that we think should be crafted by female politicians, but there are female politicians, by those that are arguing against discrimination that already exists in both the developed and developing world, something that we want to make as inclusive as possible. And what we want to do is ensure that it is simply the law, that for those cities where these special economic benefits apply, you have to hire women in management positions. You have to hire women throughout your workforce. No, thank you. All economic activities, except the purchase of goods and services, have to be done by women. Now, we do see still possibilities for men, of course, to live in these cities. They will be buying many of the goods and services. They could even be potentially working outside of the cities, as is often the case already under the status quo. No, thank you. But the point is this. These will be cities in which 100% of production and management is done by women, and the returns for companies to invest in those cities is enormous. So let's talk first of all about what the problem is. No, thank you. The problem is we have an overwhelming amount of discrimination against women in the workforce, in the economy. Why is that so? Number one, it's often because there is simply active discrimination. There are men out there who can see that women pose a very real economic threat to them. There are men out there who have grown up in households where they thought that a woman's place was in the home. There are men out there that have grown up with the idea that it is simply contrary to their religion for women to participate in economic activities, and there's been a particular interpretation that we think is wrong that has been given to them that confirms that. No, thank you. You often get that very real active discrimination. And we have to acknowledge at the outset of this debate, the overwhelming majority of states do not have discrimination laws on their books that prevent that from happening, that prevent a male employer from saying to a woman, I will not hire you because you are a woman. No, thank you both. And we think that that is wrong. If it is the case that you do have those discrimination laws on the books, you still have implicit bias. And that applies at both the top and the bottom of companies. This is an implicit bias that says, sure, we will meet your quota laws. Sure, we will meet affirmative action regulation. We will hire women, but we will not put them into positions of leadership. And if we do put them into positions of leadership, we'll put them in the soft leadership skills. We will do everything we can to sideline and marginalize women in our workforce. No, thank you. And often it's not done with it. And in fact, we think in many cases it's not done with any kind of deliberate, conscious sense of discrimination against those women. It is simply done on the basis of a selection of particular assumptions about women that is continually affirmed over and over again. But perhaps what's most troubling, every time those assumptions are confirmed, it confirms it for women. I think that that is a very real problem when every time you send a message to the woman that is applying for a job as a CEO or a strong management position that she is not qualified to do it. It makes it harder for her to continue progressing in the workforce. It confirms her own self-doubts potentially, and it also sends a very negative signal to other women in the workforce. No, thank you. We also think we have very strong socialized networks. So even if, for instance, you improve affirmative action for women in schools, you still have old boys networks where men stick together. They socialize more often in the corporate world, and they're more likely to back each other up in a way that is very counterproductive for women getting ahead in the workforce. We think that that is a big problem. We also think that women, and we see this over and over again when it comes to negotiation skills and negotiation experience, women are at a disadvantage to men and end up with a situation where both because of that, but also because of serious assumptions about whether or not women should be the main child rearers and a lack of support for men also taking a role which we think is valuable in looking after children, women end up getting completely screwed over, whereby they don't end up with a specialized, tailored package to look after children, as well as participating in the workforce or being able to share responsibilities with men. No, thank you. We think that this is a problem at the top, but it's perhaps worst of all at the bottom, where women are overwhelmingly denied possibilities in semi-skilled manual labor and are then not protected by discrimination legislation. How does this change it? It changes it by lowering transaction costs for businesses to move into these cities. That means you dramatically improve the bargaining power of women in those cities. We want to make this very clear. We think that this has long-term demonstrative effects for women outside those cities. But even if we accept analysis from the opposition that that's not the case, we think that just around for women in those cities, and that's a lot of women, we think that this is an incredibly positive model. I'll let you go.
If most businesses are owned by men, and there is enormous economic gain to be had, why won't the male-owned businesses outbid the very few number of female-owned businesses for these firms?
Because you're lowering the transaction costs for businesses to move into these cities, right? So if you have, let's say you're a woman who has a small struggling business, right? And you can't get any opportunities in your country under the status quo. What this model does is it says, we're going to give you a massive tax break if you move into this particular city. We think that's an incredibly powerful thing that increases the number of female-owned businesses. If you are a male that owns a business, if you want to move into this city, fine, do that. You're going to have to ensure that some of the subsidiary is actually owned and managed by women. That is a very powerful thing. That's good for those women on the ground. It also means your entire workforce has to be women. That is an incredibly powerful thing. And for those women that are at the top in the management, but even also at the bottom, you improve the chances that they're going to be able to work their way up through the corporate ladder to ultimately owning the entire business. You get more women working with each other. We think that that is a very powerful thing. Showing women how to work better, how to socialize better, how to ensure that they can support each other as a network. You get women being able to show a demonstrative effect to other women throughout the country, to their daughters, to their sons, to their husbands, that it is right for women to be in the workforce, that it is economically beneficial for women to be in the workforce, that is not contrary to any of their existing assumptions about whether or not there will be a harmful effect on the raising of their children. All of those stupid assumptions that we think are just unreasonable and are contrary to evidence, we can rebut through a demonstrative effect because these cities can and will work. But even if we don't accept that, for those women on the ground, there's just more jobs, there's just more management and more income. Income means more choice over your life. It increases your capacity to say to your husband, to say to your spouse, you can't hit me because I actually have the capacity to leave the home and buy my own house, to have my own independent security. That means we reduce domestic violence. It means we reduce emotional abuse. It means we reduce the capacity for men to determine the choices of women in their lives. Tasha is going to speak about the developing world. We are very proud to propose.
Madam Speaker, when 50% of the workforce in the US is female, when the EU has had for 30 years, 40 years, protections, ever-increasing protections, policies to integrate women into economic society, into positions of economic power, when we can see plainly from the real world around us that the reality is changing, the reality that opening government wants to describe you is not the one in which we live today, then we say that absolutely this is a regressive step. It is one which undermines all the progress that we have made thus far, and it's one which drives a dagger through the heart of the feminist movement, one which gives you a schism from which that feminist movement loses capital and cannot come back. That is our case in opening opposition today. We think that in a world where people are able to be CEOs of some of the largest companies in the world, like Yahoo, Arriva, in agribusiness, and typically and traditionally male business, we think that is incredibly emblematic of the progress which has been made. We think that by having individuals together and united, you are able to use the common female experience and say campaign for things like like choice, campaign for things like abortion rights, and that those campaigns have been extremely successful. We think that the next step is to campaign for more and more progress in the developed world, which he deals with primarily in his speech, to be able to deal with other things like catcalling on the street. And we think that by having people use their common experience, you're better able to do that. Okay, so what do we want to do, first of all? First of all, I want to talk about two things that he says that don't fit in. He says that the vast majority of countries don't have discrimination laws. That's simply untrue. We say that in the vast majority they've improved the situation enormously. But furthermore, we think that in countries that don't yet have those laws, we say that those are the first step in normalizing people's attitudes towards discrimination and ensuring that that discrimination does not continue to happen going forward. We think that secondly, he makes this claim at the end of his speech that, well, magically women will get more money this way and that will end domestic violence. Hang on a second. Domestic violence doesn't happen because you don't have money or aren't economically empowered. You can't be hit, but you can still be hit by your husband even if you're economically empowered. The reason for that is because that domestic violence is essentially a product of social values, of social norms, which we say they actually entrench on their side by saying that you are somehow different because you are a woman and need to be treated differently. No, thank you. So let's talk about the harms to women who are actually within these economic zones. We say what this policy does actually suggests that you are not as good as men, that you somehow need protection, that you somehow can't compete and shouldn't expect to compete in the integrated world that we see around us today, and therefore you should just opt out. We say, firstly, that sends a very damaging message to children who internalize this, not just girls, but also boys who don't expect that they will have to interact with women in the future, who don't expect that this is something that basically that they should have to treat people as equals and think that people have different functions in life just because of how they are born. We think that's the exact rhetoric that we're actually trying to fight against in this debate. We think furthermore, though, that for the people who do move to those areas, there's a great sense of tokenism. Any achievement that you do make there can essentially be devalued and taken away from you because we say, well, if there was a man there who could have competed with you for that job, then you wouldn't have actually gotten it. Let's see you out in the integrated world and see how you do there. So we don't think this actually creates an economic safe space for those individuals. We think then he says, well, the problem in this debate is that very sexist men exist. Well, we think not necessarily. We think very often what you need is individual capital, and that's not increased on this side because you don't have on their side of the house role models to see who you see interacting with men in an economic zone. You're not able to see, for example, another woman asking for a promotion. You're not able to see another woman getting a promotion ahead of a man. Those are the sorts of things which inspire people to move forward and to actually better themselves. Furthermore, though, it's not clear from their side of the house whether they ever expect these individuals to reintegrate after taking part in these economic zones, because we say that will be much harder for them because they don't have these role models. They don't see this interaction. Furthermore, the world that they'll be moving back into will be one which is more identifies women to go to this place themselves being there in the first place. I want to ask you now about why this will create an internal schism within the movement.
Given that these zones will have managerial positions and hierarchies, why on earth are you asserting that there won't be no one will see women getting?
Because I told you that the type of role model is different. That role model getting that job ahead of a man. Listen to what I'm saying. Secondly, because I've already told you that we do have people in those management positions in the status quo, just not as many as we like. Note that the trend is that we get more and more all the time, and companies are very eager to increase the number of women that they have involved. No, thank you. We think that secondly, in this, what you do is that you divide the interests of women, right? Firstly, because you say that there are two types of people who are going to move into these areas, right? People who are struggling in the status quo and can't get jobs, so are going to move in here and are therefore open and ripe for exploitation. We think the second type of people are people who have lots of money, like this guy says in proposition, and who therefore can take advantage of new managerial positions that they can't otherwise access. The problem there is that you could create a massive difference. There is a massive economic difference and power differential between those people. So effectively, what you get is people using markets to exploit each other, and you don't get people interacting on the basis of commonality, but rather you just get the same exploitation that they have in the status quo, except that now only women are allowed, which somehow makes it better. We think that furthermore, though, that what happens when the most privileged get all the top jobs, which is what they seem to want, is that you get the attitude that feminism and special economic zones are really for rich white women. That feminism is not something that speaks to all. That feminism isn't something that benefits everybody, and this is simply another way of exploiting those who are most marginalized within society. We think that equality skeptics then get to point to your rhetoric and say that, look, you are divided. You are divided. You don't all want the same types of freedoms. They get to discredit your movement when there is internal bickering, when people say, I want a pay rise from my female employer. We say that then male-dominated employers say, look, this isn't because we're discriminatory. This is just how the market works. They then get to blame all the discrimination on the market rather than blaming it on actual sexism. But we think furthermore that this harms people who are outside of these economic zones too, in a number of ways. Firstly, it's simply economically inefficient to draw a line through society and say only certain people can have these jobs. Why? One, because it means that you don't always get the best person doing that job. Two, it means that you socialize women away who might be very good at doing jobs in the integrated world from actually doing those jobs because they don't feel safe in that world anymore. Three, though, we say that if this is very successful and demand for these jobs is really, really high, what's going to happen? Pay plummets. You're going to get paid less as compensation for working in a safer environment and one where you feel comfortable. How does that ever incentivize you to go and get a job in these areas and to integrate and to actually empower yourself and everyone else? Finally, we think it means that you create different problems in different places and divide the capital that you have. For example, a problem that women have in the workplace is that they are seen as pushy. We think that continues to be the case in the integrated environment. However, that you lose the capital of all the people who work in a women-only environment who no longer experience that difficulty. Therefore, you divide the experience of people. You lose the commonality, which is so strong within which can be so strong and so effective within any movement seeking equality. For those reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Reducing it to female high. Okay, three things today in proposition. Firstly, number one, why women get economic empowerment and why that is so crucial in terms of having a fungible asset which allows women to make generalized choice, why that empowers them both within these special economic zones, something we got no engagement on. All we got was engagement on the demonstrative effect, and why that empowers them more generally outside of these economic zones, although we're not as concerned about this. Then secondly, we've got a discussion about how women in developing states, and then finally a discussion about empowering female-focused corporate cultures and empowering women domestically. First of all, however, some rebuttal. So number one, we get the sense that we get a rhetoric of separatism, and that is bad. And number one, because it's a bad model for children, because we get tokenism. Number one, we suggest that is not true, because at the moment, right, when children observe that men do well, right, they just see it as normal. They see it as men getting promotions, despite it getting men promotions over other men. At the point at which children are embedded in a female-centric culture, they will simply see it as normal that women are getting promotions. It's not that men are being screwed over and women are being tokenistic. It's just reversing exactly the same patriarchal assumptions as we currently have. Secondly, we say that tokenism problem exists more stringently under your side, where we have things like explicit quotas, right? The notion that women who become CEOs, even when those quotas aren't formalized, aren't called token women, is patent bullshit, right? Even among debating societies, people are like, oh, there's the token girl on the team, right? Even if we don't have explicit quotas. So the notion that it's not framed as tokenism is also untrue. Thirdly, we say that actually, particularly in corporate cultures in which women are specific tokens, they have to point out that they're not tokens, particularly by denigrating the skills of other women, by saying, you know what, and specifically by masculinizing themselves. So they say, for example, the one of the 4 women who are on the chair of the FTSE 100 company said, women need to realize that having children is not a responsible option. It demonstrates that you are not dedicated to your job. Actually, what women do when you have them embedded in a male corporate culture is they send out a bad message to children because they are forced to adhere to a series of implicit norms about what it is acceptable for women to do, and those are male focused. Secondly, we're told that actually people who are hostile to women, I hate to break it to you guys, people are hostile to women at the moment, right? Women who do get economically advanced at the cost of their ability to choose, at the cost of their ability to have things like flexible labor hours, at the cost of, for example, being raped by their employer and not reporting it. We say those things already exist. Moreover, we're perfectly happy for these women to stay in special economic zones if we don't get any change. We think at least we're changing the lives for hundreds of thousands of women. We'll expand the program if we don't get any change externally. Thirdly, we're told that we destroy women's ability to campaign for change. Number one, women at the top of businesses, who are the only ones we see getting significant progress at the moment, don't campaign for change because they can opt out of social issues when they have loads of cash. They don't need to worry about things like abortion law and reproductive rights because ultimately they can fly to another state if they do it. They can opt out of a lot of cash. Women at the bottom who Pat focused on can't do that, and they don't get the campaign for change currently by female CEOs. What we need, therefore, is a change at the lower levels of the labour force where we don't get any of that anti-discrimination law actually being employed in practice, because women don't have the cash, even if those laws are there, to prosecute those cases. Needs something that needs to be engaged with. Thirdly, we're told that we destroy female capital because they exploit each other. Number one, we think a lot of the forms of exploitation of women in the labour force are because of structural reasons why women's employment in the labour force is slightly different. For example, things like maternity leave, right? Those are impossible to discriminate against women for because they are the only form of labour force. Thus, even if women exploited each other economically, there is a significant series of different types of discriminations which are now factually excluded because it is impossible to find any alternative to these people to employ. So, but moreover, we'll talk about this more in a second, developing states, right, where women just aren't employed in some cases because of religious reasons or cultural reasons which stigmatize women going out into the workforce. Again, we change that. Thirdly, we're told that we can discredit women who bicker. It is unclear, again, why A, we care in a world where women are consistently discriminated against, whether that's true, or B, we need to engage why on the comparative improvement for all the women in other states in these special economic zones is worth less. And thirdly, we need some analysis of why women actually will bicker more than things like labour disputes, right, which don't need to be framed as bitches having a fight. And if it is, that's probably an indication the world is very misogynistic and we're not going that far with it. Thirdly, we're told these things will be economically inefficient. Again, unclear why, I think things like tax breaks and subsidies. Oh, something on female ownership. Note this, but economic activity does mean things like ownership of contracts, tenders, property, and subsidiaries, right? So it does mean that corporations who want to enter these special economic zones have to place women in charge of subsidiary organizations within these special economic zones, empowering them in terms of capital. No, thank you. Now, quickly, moving on very swiftly. To economic empowerment more generally. Number one, cash is the most fungible way of getting choice. Right? At the moment, women do not have cash, and therefore they lack choice. CF Pat. So, secondly, when they do try and get cash, they have to be employed in things which are owned by men. That means they have to abide by male standards. That means accepting things like discrimination when it occurs. Moreover, even if they do get cash, they have to feed it back into a male culture, which perpetuates the economic imbalances which continue to oppress women. That means that women have to ignore discriminatory practices, not just ignore, but perpetuate discriminatory practices. This model corrects it because women are the only labour force and the only ones who get employment, so discrimination and descriptive characteristics is not possible. Moreover, women actually own property because they have to be CEOs, own subsidiaries, own contracts and tenders. So you forcibly economically empower them. What that means is that if they go out into the wider world, they have that capital to invest in the wider world, right? They have that capacity to make economic choice. Go ahead.
Is it your case then that no women should seek to be involved in an integrated society? If so, why?
No, we think it is their choice to do so, but we want to offer them the option to opt out of an economic structure which is discriminated against them for 2,000 years. Okay, right, so women get their own property. Moreover, we think that it corrects that property distribution imbalance more widely because these special economic zones will be there as a trickle-down effect more generally because women can invest capital into wider states and change corporate culture. Thirdly, we say we empower women in states where they're separate. For example, CS Saudi Arabia. McKinsey had one female employee there. They had to build a separate office for her. We would like to see that more generally, that millions of Saudi women can get jobs and do things like resist discrimination in employment. They're like, hang on, women get beaten if they're rich. That's true, but they have more of an option to opt out. It is still true that disproportionately poorer women get more beaten because they don't have that capital to say, I am worth something, and if you beat me, I will leave, right? That is an additional trap that women get, and at least we are changing one of those. Finally, on a female-focused corporate culture, we suggest that actually, women may think differently, they may not. They may require different and flexible forms of labour. At the point at which you have a solely female labour force, what you can get is a natural experiment in how actually we might get female-focused employment structures and employment practices. We will never get that in a world where companies are focused on profit and averse to experimentation, in particular because they are run by men who are highly averse to allowing women to this because they feel incredibly threatened by this and are incredibly conservative. We therefore beg to have this natural experiment and empower women more generally. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Leader of Opposition, please.
It's like Cambridge all over again. Tash speaks of choice. She says she wants the ability of all women to be able to have a life that's great for them. What Michael tells you on our side of the house, which goes unresponded to, is that when you have lots of women flock into these zones, which are principally going to be small areas within these countries, what happens to the rest of the women outside of those zones who don't have those role models in their society to say, look, that oppression you're suffering is wrong, who don't have senior members of management who are women within those jobs to say this kind of oppression is wrong and we won't stand for it? What happens to those individuals who now are told, no, you can't get any job at all because there aren't enough women working there for you to be safe, for you not to be discriminated against? What happens about those women, the majority of these women in these countries? And we get no response whatsoever. Firstly, let's clear something up, right? We hear at the very end of the speech this idea about Saudi Arabia and why it's worked very well. We're happy to acknowledge that in certain unique cases, this might be a really great idea, right? They need to explain why it's a really good idea everywhere. Again, very little engagement with lots of the stuff Michael tells you on that particular issue, right? We then get this red herring idea, which is at the moment, the problem is when you pay women money, that money goes to men. That exists on either side of the house, right? Given they're still going to be members of families, they're still going to have, if they live in oppressive households, even if they work in women-only areas, do you think their oppressive husbands are going to allow them to continue to have separate bank accounts and use that kind of stuff? No, it's not. It's completely non-comparative in this debate. We hear that it's good for women because at the moment, if you don't have any cash, you don't have any choice. We say to a certain extent that's obviously true, but why that choice reduced on their side of the house? First of all, Michael explains to you that the money that you'll receive in their zones is going to be less than the money you'd receive on ours. Why does this happen? Two reasons. Firstly, the reason they give you. They tell you there's going to be a huge amount of demand for these jobs. If there's a huge amount of demand for these jobs, that necessarily lowers the wages that are going to be paid for these jobs, right? The comparative on our side of the house is twofold. First of all, we say we can have affirmative action policies in these regions which says you have to give 30% of these jobs to these women and you have to pay them the same as men, right? That's really important. The second response is, on our side of the house, when women learn, so men earn particular wage, and women will be working in the same industries and all the examples Michael tells you, just look at the rest of the world, right? If they're earning less, we can actually take that to court and say, look, we've got this senior manager who's being paid 50,000, he's a man, and this woman is being paid 35,000, she's a woman. That's wrong, that needs to stop. On their side of the house, when everyone is a woman getting paid, if they all get paid substantially lower, there's no way for them to say, look, this money is less. Second, what we say is it becomes harder for women outside of these zones to get promotion. I'm going to expand on that with my substantive, right? So why does this reduce aspirations for women and girls in general, right? Firstly, what we say is you see far fewer women competing and succeeding with men and over men. Why is that? Necessarily what their policy says is that the best thing for you to do as a woman is to go to these zones, right? And lots of people will go to these zones. We acknowledge that. But what does that mean? That means that you see lots of women who otherwise would have been competing and getting jobs over men not getting those jobs anymore, right? So you have fewer women in the rest of these zones, which, by the way, are obviously the majority of the country, succeeding. Why is that so important? We say even with affirmative action policies on our side of the house, why is the tokenism far less bad? Firstly, because the way you get rid of discrimination often is to show that men and women are the same. So when you have a woman who gets a job through an affirmative action policy and she's seen by her colleagues to actually be a really good candidate and someone who works really well, that on a micro level shows men that women can actually work like them, are like the same as them. This then happens within all of these individual businesses within that country and leads to the macro change we're talking about, because the general perception of women then changes because men have seen on an individual level that actually the women they work with and that their friends work with are actually capable. Moreover, what we say is that actually women who even get the first job through affirmative action, then often go on to get promotions without affirmative action within that job. You harm that on their side of the house because far fewer people go to these kind of areas, right? The second thing is you increase the, and this is incredibly important, as this shows that the number of women who apply for any job in general reduces, is you increase the idea amongst young boys, men, and women in general that women just can't compete with men at all, right? You say, look, you need your own separate zone to get jobs. That's how incapable you are of doing the job that the rest of us can do. You can't compete with us on any level. Even affirmative action isn't enough for you. You can't actually be around us because you're that incompetent. These guys are going to claim offense. That's obviously not what we believe. That is the views that are going to happen. If those aren't the views that are going to exist, then we don't need this policy at all, because then it wouldn't be a problem, right? Why is that so important? We say that young girls in particular build an identity based on how other people view them, right? We say that at a young age, if boys are telling you, look, there are zones for you women, right? Don't be bothering applying for the jobs we're going to apply for. That's where you belong. You are, one, more likely at best to apply for those areas, but two, are far more likely just to believe you can't compete on any level with these jobs at all. So where do you see your comparative advantage? In the caregiving roles that they already believe that they are suited for, and that's what's more likely to happen. Secondly, what we tell you is that it harms your ability, if you live in oppressive households, to get those jobs. Why is it? Because now patriarchal families realize that in the regular kind of jobs where at the moment there are some women working, that there are far fewer women working there because they now go to these particular areas, right? Why is that dangerous? That's dangerous because now men are often willing in these regions to let women go to work because they feel, okay, fine, there are other women there, you're not going to be good at, you're not going to be oppressed, there are other people who can help you there. If there are fewer women in those areas now to help you, it's less likely that's going to happen. I'll take Michael.
Given that you erroneously contend that women are doing really well in the status quo and wages will automatically be really low in these places, why is it that you also contend women will flock to them having this whole week?
No, because the reasons that they're gonna, like, the women you want to go there will go there is because you're telling them, look, we can give you jobs and these jobs exist, right? At the moment we can tell them, look, there are other jobs in the rest of society which you can get. You undermine that message on your side of the house. Tash talks about masculinization. You get more masculinization on their side of the house because now there are fewer women who aren't masculinized in other areas saying, look, this is another option. You can be a business leader. She's right to say there aren't as many as we'd like. That trend is changing at the moment. You set that trend back when all the women who could have done that are now working in women-only areas. That means that when you are now growing up as one of the few women who works outside these areas, you don't actually see the other option. You see fewer women being in these roles. The question we need to ask ourselves at the end of this debate is not, is there a problem at the moment? There obviously is, obviously awful. The question is, do you aspire women to believe that they can be the same as men? And do you tell the men who need to also believe that women are equal to them that they can be the same? claim when you say we have specific zones? We say no. Secondly, do you harm those ability of those women who live outside these regions to gain the support they need when the women they need to call out sexism, call out oppression, have left? We say no as well. And for those reasons and the others we've given you, we couldn't be prouder to oppose.
Thank you. Member of Government, please.
Okay, we want to look first of all at how the status quo actively demeans women, how you don't get any signaling disbenefits that they try to prove, like telling women they're less or telling women they can only work in those, how that does happen very actively in the status quo. Secondly, I'm going to be looking at greater mainstream interaction, how it enables women to invest more in what Michael terms mainstream economics, how it also combats economic inefficiency. And then thirdly, I'm going to be looking at incumbent social development, how it leads to greater social agitation, so like class solidarity, and how it also has incumbent benefits like increasing educational incentives, increasing incentives of the state to invest in that kind of stuff. Right from the start then, in the first point, in how the status quo means women, right from the start of Michael O'Dwyer's speech, sorry, I said that to difference from Michael Bart, but right from the start he said like such improvements like in the EU and the US and I'm sure in other places, like he limits in scope those benefits of things like anti-discrimination laws, like disproportionately in this motion. Like they cannot apply to all regions they talk about, but we will engage there first. Stephen qualified later. Michael says you're less likely to see women in those regions getting promoted or in those countries. Like women are actively suppressed in his countries or in the more developed countries that he does talk about. Look at tech companies in the US in the 90s. As they gained in value moving into the 21st century, promotion rates for women actually dropped since the 1990s. As it increased in value, women were more excluded. It's not an improvement as men maintained micro-social dominance, no thank you, within those institutions and within those workplaces. There are undervalued classes that are suppressed within environments where they don't occupy leadership positions and where those dominant structures perpetuate themselves because the environment isn't owned by them. They talk about mitigating that with anti-discrimination laws in the first opposition speech. Like not even in his few examples does that work, no thank you. Like men in these companies have more capital stock. Men within those corporate structures have more abilities, have more networks to be able to get promoted, have people who they know better, perhaps better educational opportunities early on or better schooling, have better promotional networks. Proposition constrain that betterment to that environment. They constrain it to active suppression or micro-suppression. They're more effective by men. Then they say, but you lack role models. No, thank you. Like even still, it's better because it's so empowering to see women go and getting them like men or women at the very least beating the boys. Like that's demonstrated by non-promotion. First of all, it's demonstrated by non-promotion owing to sexist structures that we've managed to. An OG model, this is women definitely occupying leadership positions. First of all, you avoid things like discrimination against maternity leave or discrimination against the fact that women can get pregnant. Like far less likely, as OG say, to get that. Avoid hiring discrimination when more people are that category that is hurt, when more are that category that might get pregnant and that might be forced in some instances or in poorer countries to have to take time off work. Like you lose that kind of micro-suppression. Also things like men being more likely to tell women what to wear that feeds into sexual harassment structures that actively suppresses women. Obviously a harm in itself, but also massively harmful for their betterment and for their ability to prosper within that corporate structure. So then he says that no, this is still bad because it says women are less than by first of all saying they're less than the men because they need their own special place and also by saying that they can't compete with men, and that's just harmful. Like, but these are social spaces that in other ways constantly demean women. These are social spaces that tell women that they are less valuable by making them have, no thank you, less valuable, less lucrative promotion opportunities. It happens right now when we see women in virtually no boardroom positions. Stephen says, well, they would be otherwise competing. Like in the status quo, girls lack an explanation for that. Those young girls that he talks about lack an explanation for what is empirically a disastrous promotion rate, a disastrous rate of high leadership positions. So we're able to explain that. Like they suffer as they lack social outlets, particularly in countries that they decide to engage with later on, like Saudi Arabia, where this policy has been enacted. It's empowering by giving a social outlet, by making sure that that there are like female-dominated spaces, female in leadership positions. He says men say they're lesser, like men do that already with hierarchical spaces. They're forced to move between male-dominated environments. It's empowering and subversive to have women in leadership positions there, establishing women as customers, and yes, where men can also be customers too. So we also avoid the siblings there that they raise. Secondly, on greater like mainstream interaction and how you actually increase involvement there before
majority of women live outside these areas, and now tell those people that they can't get any job at all because the only jobs they should be aspiring to are ones only for women in these particular zones. Why is it okay to do that to those individuals?
Like, first of all, it wasn't actually strictly geographically constrained early on. It isn't necessarily, even if it is. What you have are people who are left behind. When they talk about people being left behind, look at the fact that working class women are more actively hurt in the status quo. Because working class jobs and jobs available to them are ones that more stress physicality. The very lowest tier jobs in most economies stress physicality, stress menial labor, and women are more excluded by that when it fetishizes those things, no thank you, or when it stresses basic labor. We give working class women better opportunities there, women who would otherwise be completely left out. Like, that leads to better opportunities to get on the ladder, it leads to better opportunities to develop savings for greater mainstream interaction that they otherwise lose out on. It's harder for those women to invest. That leads to things like greater unemployment amongst working class women, with women disproportionately occupying the poverty brackets of those countries. They are the side that leaves the most vulnerable behind. They are the side that leaves the poorest women behind. Those are women who would not get any work on the comparative. Those are women who are excluded from, like, the mainstream zone in the comparative anyway, so we don't see how they win on that. Then when they talk about opening opposition, talk about, like, there's less need to engage elsewhere, or it's a more hostile mainstream to women when there are fewer women there. Again, that's unclear. They're excluded right now from business startups and things like that, owing to a lack of relative startup capital, given that men disproportionately own capital or are just richer, but also better opportunities to transfer to the mainstream. Things like developing business and leadership acumen that we have proved they're less likely to get a chance to develop those kind of leadership skills in the mainstream. Also developing contracts, developing contacts, developing, no thank you, boosting their CV. Like, what happens to those women left behind? Those are the majority of women, no thank you, who get less opportunities to fill their CV, who get less opportunities to occupy those leadership roles. Then thirdly, on social development. They say there's less pay on our side's jobs because probably. Like, in Saudi Arabia, no thank you, this is empirically untrue. Women in special economic zones earn a bullion wage. Like, why? Because when they like discuss things like affirmative action, that's politically unpalatable. It was the reason for special economic zones as opposed to affirmative action being enacted in Saudi Arabia. It's unpalatable owing to things like segregated gender politics. Affirmative action is massively unpalatable for those things. Like, also, when you do get men as customers in the special economic zones that side proposition brings you, you do avoid the disbenefits, or the signaling disbenefits they talk of men and women being separated, or of men viewing women as lesser in that sense. Then when Stephen says on a practical challenge, like, oh, there's still oppressive areas, they still, like, men are still able to control, for instance, accounts, are still able to control financial structures. Again, look at things like educational development. There's an incentive in countries of low female employment, or a lack of incentive in countries of low female employment, to invest in education for women. That's because women are not viewed as capital actors, women are not viewed as things that reward the state. You make an incentive for the state to trust them as profit-making and to see them as profit-making, to invest in their education early on. Currently, those incentives don't exist. Currently, they're massively devalued when they're viewed only as free to there's no incentive to better them. That's not, as Michael termed, economically efficient. We win on that as well. We get educational prospects. We increase personal wealth so they can move elsewhere. We also make more political demands for more freedoms. They were at the forefront of political agitation recently in Saudi Arabia. We increased their economic role by not just making social space, but also class solidarity. We're so proud to propose.
Thank the previous speaker and welcome the member in opposition.
We're going to look in extension at what the treatment of these zones by companies actually looks like, and the way that you force these social lifestyles and the actual lives of women to be disrupted by the establishment of these zones. That's going to constitute a couple of things. First, I'm going to look at, in particular, why for problems they exist, how the treatment of those zones will be really problematic, and the economic opportunities that exist do nothing to claim back the power that they say men have. And second, I'm going to look at why this abandons ideological battles for feminism for women, and in doing so also abandons the people they apparently care about, which is the least advantaged women. We're going to argue why it's ridiculous to say those women aren't having opportunities, that is to say exploited at the moment. So what do we think that this actually looks like? The first thing I'm going to explain is what we think a realistic alternative looks like, because it is true there is a path to progress, but what does improving that path look like? Number one, it looks like using the enormous amount of capital the state diverts to women now to do things like offer companies incentives to hire women, not just affirmative action. So they get a benefit from having women within existing corporate structures, that is to say, not making businesses now entirely male spaces, which we think is a problematic thing. Number two, we say you have education and scholarships and offer those incentives in the same way many Western countries do now with things like disability advocates, to say that those jobs can be valuable for people and that the company itself gets a benefit from that. Notably, that is a path to improve change. Lastly, Madam Speaker, we say this looks like the change of culture that happening in Japan at the moment, where you see that the dominant male culture of business culture has failed that country, and where that economic failure is widespread and affects men and not just women who experience failure in these special zones, that men then have an incentive to do something about it as they are at the moment. Special economic zones in Japan like that just put exacerbated failure on zones of women who have less experience and skills and allow men to point to women subsequently as the reason for the failure of that economics more generally. We think that is the problem. Second, what do these zones actually look like? Because the case of government relies on this generating a lot of capital, and that capital being well distributed between women. Notably, they said this was particularly important for really disadvantaged women. What does this actually look like? Number one, you force the separation of women and men in everyday lives, because it's stupid to say that men can live and buy things in these zones when the reality is that you have to work in vastly physically separate areas. So you separate families and men, women. If that family unit, just living with other people who are not of your gender, is important to you, those people are no longer going into those zones. Number two, they don't change the dominant in corporate culture and of economic power of men, because they admitted that most companies are owned by men. But we don't think that particularly changes. You just exploit women by companies that are owned in that way by men and entrench that power more for the companies that have a dominant position in the market than you do for individual women who at best get marginally more positions than they otherwise would, especially when the trend is increasing towards them getting more of those executive positions or basic positions. Three, what do special economic zones in particular look like in this? It looks like the exploitation of excess labor by companies like Foxconn in China to exert their economic power and exploit people within those zones, and notably to excuse that exploitation by saying it is a separate economic zone and that economic policy is different. And in this case, by women. So if it fails, which they have to admit is at least somewhat of a possibility, if it fails, you point to the failure of women to economically be able to look after themselves, as opposed to at the moment pointing to the failure of men to integrate them into that culture. That's the worst possible thing they can talk about. Second point, how this loses a series of ideological battles for women and for feminism, because notably they're also talking about modernized developed countries that have relatively good economic participation of women. So at what point then, what battles are we talking about? Number one, we say there is a battle to be had by most of feminism to say that the economic system as it exists is masculine and will be masculine, and that there is a right of women to reject that system and to have roles in things like housework, but also roles in things like their family or in more active social and community participation as being a more meaningful role. We think this focuses economic participation as a solution, but notably, it also focuses the capital that these countries have, especially developing countries, for encouraging women's participation or policies like allowing poor people to access services on that problem and on incentivizing special economic zones. So it makes it all the more difficult to advocate for different solutions. Let's say things like contraception for the women who will remain poor under your system, regardless of where they get those jobs from, because there will always be that underclass. No. Second, you characterize women's economic participation as aggressive and as different, and you characterize it as looking different and special, because that's exactly what you said. You wanted these policies to look very different. You wanted the economic zone to look different. What that speaks to men is to say that women are fundamentally different from you, and their integration into your business culture for a large number of women who can't participate in these zones is something that you should be fearful of or in some way worry about being different from you. We think that's the worst possible way to win that battle. Lastly, in this point, you set back internal policies that matter for most women, notably because departments, if there are requirements for them to hire women, can hire them in those special economic zones, but also because you remove the market incentive to punish companies that actually are sexist, because you say that they can just operate in these zones. I'll take closing.
In countries that we actually raised where hiring practices actively discriminate against women, you increase not only educational incentives, but also CV opportunities to engage more women.
The majority of those opportunities don't change in number because we think you transfer minimal opportunities all over the country into one zone, which isn't beneficial. And the second point I'll make here is that empowerment is not meaningful when it doesn't transfer, which it doesn't, because you make these women's participation a special participation and not one that has been done in the general economic frontiers most people are familiar with. So it means that those credentials don't actually transfer, and notably that men don't see women participate. They also don't buy there will be increased economic benefit in these zones rather than exploitation of those women's labor, who is apparently starting off from a less skilled position. To believe there are reasons that this is a problem, there are intense attitudes that are discriminatory that say you should treat women less well. Lastly, on the least advantaged women, it is a lie to pretend that poor women are not put into jobs at the moment, especially notably when you're talking about garment factories. What then do we think is notable? They're not promoting the empowerment of those women. They just have different people in charge of their exploitation. We don't think women are less likely to do that. Notably, you don't stop discrimination on pregnancy, guys, because some people say they're just not going to get pregnant, so that discrimination exists. But those women in those positions have less economic power and demand on the state, and you tell them that their role belongs with other women and not with men or with any other role in society. Their own economic power is in the hands, and if they fail, that's their problem. That's what you tell women, that's what you tell that society. That's why we're proud to oppose.
Thank you. Please.
Three things in this debate, Madam Speaker. I'm going to talk first of all about workplace dignity, what the actual status quo is, how that harms women, how that's comparatively better, and how we create better working environments for women, revisiting a lot of Hughes material that CEO decided they didn't feel like responding to. Secondly, again, on the same theme, because this is a broad theme with regard to how they interacted with Hughes' speech, talking about economic opportunities, how all of the aims that OO have with regard to economic integration more widely, and CEO seem to share those aims, are better on our side of the house when we get more purchase in the mainstream economy. And then finally, I want to talk about social change and how on a macro scale we get a variety of benefits, again, to which we don't hear much response. Most rebuttal interwoven four things that stand out. One, genuinely, as we told them in the POI, we are confused by what OO understand to be the incentive structure facing women here, because they tell us that women are A, doing quite well under the status quo. We don't think that's true, but they think it's true, right? And B, that wages in these areas will be incredibly bad, but then C, that women are going to flock to these areas such that structural incentives for women elsewhere in the economy are completely undermined. Those just can't all be true. And then when we ask for an explicit explanation of this, they just say, because you're telling women to go there. We don't think women are stupid. Like, if wages are that much worse in these places, and if women are doing so well in the status quo, they presumably won't go there. This gets even more confusing. The CEO tell us these areas are going to fail, even though OO tell us that women are going to flock through to them. We don't understand what they think women are like in terms of their incentives. Secondly, let's just note that they want to base this debate in the most idealized possible version of the world. Their status quo is like a quite idealistic analysis of how like Sweden works, right? They don't engage with the developing world. They don't engage with the fact that the kinds of benefits that they can have under the status quo just don't exist in much of the world. They don't engage, for example, with the fact that there are countries where it is literally not possible for women to work alongside men, where this is a choice between working only in domestic labor, working in the mainstream economy. We think comparatively we talk about what applies to more women, what is most relevant. Thirdly, on this idea that we get from CO about segregation, and to some extent from O about segregation, like women are in different spheres now, so they look really different. One, this is the status quo in lots of countries. You have extremely strong perceptions of like which genders are which and how those are divided. We don't know how this is not like meaningfully better. Secondly, we do think men interact with these zones. Hugh tells you men will be customers in these zones. They can walk through. This idea that like you'll have to commute really far to get there or something doesn't hold any weight. They're parts of cities. They're zones within cities. Men will interact with them. This will not be entirely segregated. Three, we tell you get other empowerment in the mainstream economy that has strong signaling effects. Finally, they tell you that this is really bad because some women want to work in the home. That's fine. Nobody propped forcing women to work in these industries because they comparatively give them more choice. Comparatively, we create more powerful and better and more liberating working environments and better economic outcomes in the long term. If they want choice for women, they get it on our side of the house. One, workplace dignity. Hugh tells you that it is the case, much though they would like to say the contrary, because there are some female CEOs, as Tash tells you, those are a vanishingly small number. She's correct about that. Hugh tells you that lots of these workplaces are incredibly male-dominated in ways which are incredibly harmful to women. This means men get promoted significantly more. It means men are constantly telling women what to do. It means men have license to harass those women, to tell them what they can wear. It means that men are able to sexually assault those women, as OG tell us, and get away with it. This is constantly demeaning. They want to talk about signaling effects. Those signaling effects occur when women, every time they enter mainstream industry, are constantly forced to be subordinate to their male coworkers, regardless of their level of skill. Those signaling effects occur in the status quo. They simply don't engage with that. Tokenism happens on their side of the house. We on comparative get women owning businesses where men go to buy things, women actually running places, women getting more capital acquisition and making major investments, women becoming serious players in the economy of these nations. That is a comparatively better signaling effect to show to children. Finally, there are basic legal reasons, there are basic privileges that you will get from working in one of these places as a woman that they don't engage with that are important. For example, it is much less likely that necessarily they cannot discriminate against women in terms of promotions. Secondarily, they cannot discriminate on the basis of maternity leave. Right? Because all women under the status quo are presumed to be potential liabilities in terms of maternity leave because they might get pregnant regardless of what they tell you. That is not true in these industries. Like, that is necessarily a risk that you take with any employee. So those kinds of discrimination do not occur. We think that you get much better signaling at the point at which you have men seeing women doing well through these industries. We don't necessarily care about signaling effect that much in terms of like they don't impact those harms very well, right? But insofar as that's in the debate, we think it looks much better on our side of the house. Secondly, in terms of mainstream economics, some dissonant stuff from up on this, right? They tell us that rich women are the ones who get these jobs, that rich women will do rich women will take these jobs and that'll screw working class women over. But they also tell us that rich women are doing really well in the status quo. If that's true, we think these jobs are particularly useful, as Hugh tells you, to like working class urban women, the kind who don't have access to low wage jobs in the status quo because those jobs are like stereotypically male. Like manual labor is very stereotypically male. That means working class women often never get a foot on the rung of employment. They never get to advance. They never get promotions. They never get to accumulate savings. They do on our side of the house. Hugh tells you, secondly, that you get more investment. Women now have startup capital. They're able to start their own businesses in the mainstream economy if that's what OO or CO want. They're able to have those businesses because they have a greater pool of capital. They're able to therefore run businesses in the mainstream economy and get all of those benefits. More to say on this, but go.
Okay, so when this is introduced, women would like to go there because they're told you should go work there. If they're then underpaid, they can't point to a man in that job and say, I'm being underpaid comparatively. But you harm everyone else in every other job outside because those people are told you shouldn't be working here anyway, you should only work in that industry.
Great. Okay, thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Thank you. Two things on this. One, still don't understand why they go there if it's so bad for them. Again, we tell them to is not sufficient. Secondarily, they can still point their counterparts in the same industry in other parts of the economy. They can still compare their wages. There's no reason you lose that event. Finally, on the mainstream economy, Hugh tells you women are more likely to get jobs, which means they're more likely to develop skills, they're more likely to develop business acumen, they're more likely to develop CVs. That all helps them get the mainstream economic purchase that OO and CO so desperately want. Finally, on social change. One, they tell you affirmative action is great. There are lots of countries where gender segregation is such that affirmative action is not only impossible, but also integrated workplaces are in fact impossible. Saudi Arabia uses special economic zones to empower women because it is in most cases not permissible for women to work alongside men. They just necessarily cannot get that benefit on their side of the house, much though they are desperate to claim it. It makes no sense whatsoever. Secondly, in terms of female employment, it creates very strong incentives because women are now capital actors for the state to invest in the education of women. That's why lots of Saudi Arabian women are receiving technical education in terms of things like computer science because many of them operate in things like tech support. We think that is comparatively a huge benefit for women who, when they are unskilled domestic laborers or garment workers, do not get state education of that kind. Third, we think you get political action out of this, as Hugh tells you. Saudi Arabian women who interacted in the workplace were at the forefront of demands for women to be allowed to drive, are incredibly important in terms of producing positive political action. We could not
you operated. The second thing we brought you an extension was this policy necessarily removed the existing project. We needed to have a realistic trajectory in this debate. We weren't going to get Sweden everywhere, but we thought the trajectory in many societies was improving, and this policy sucked capital away. But most importantly, this didn't change the culture, no thank you, of society, because this debate was as much about improving the plight of women as it was about men and leading men to a reflection that meant that they didn't treat women in that way no longer. This absolutely didn't do that. What was the comparative we heard? OG told us under our side have to masculinize. Firstly, we question to the extent to which that's true. We point to the far increasing trajectory of women who don't have to, who can have children and get those positions. But importantly, we think it's a good thing that women challenge the idea that certain behaviors are exclusively the domain of men. No, thank you. That men are the only ones who are allowed to adopt it. Finally, they said, well, look, separatism is not as bad as male promotion. And like you charged us with tokenism. We thought, firstly, even if there may be a small amount of tokenism to begin with, the trajectory of more and more women in those management positions utterly broke that. They were not tokenistic, when slowly every corporation had it. But most importantly, you change the perspective of men. Because under their side, men never have to go to these special economic zones. They never actually have to see what's going on there. They never have to engage with it. Why did you get it? Importantly, though, they didn't change the economic incentives, which were the cause of a lot of that harm. No, thank you. What change did we say we got on our side? Firstly, we point to things like the economic failure in Japan that created mass economic incentives for men to change their behavior. That said a model where men were exclusively allowed to operate in business was not tenable in the future, and that you actually had to create sufficient incentives. We also pointed, secondly, to the increasing development, no thank you, of women. In many countries, it was incremental. They told us that they get better maternal leave policies. Firstly, we told you not all women have children, but now competitively, the corporations that operate in that sphere have a massive disadvantage to the entire male corporations that don't have anyone. That's an economic cost they're not likely to bear when they do have to compete to survive and bring turns to women opening.
Most women don't have careers, they have jobs. The forms of discrimination they experience are things like implicit bias about their physical capacities and about pregnancy. At least when they are the only available labour force, they are certain to get a job and not be fired on the basis of those. Discrimination is lessened even if it's not eliminated.
No, it's not. You don't change this because you just shut them off. You never get men to confront that bias. You just legitimize it. And importantly, for women to now go back, especially in work, if women go back, they now legitimize the behavior they subject themselves to. That's massively harmful. What are the costs of this policy? We got the extension that they get more social agitation, and they pointed to women in Saudi Arabia who worked finally, pushing to drive. That's the example of women in a male sphere saying they can actualize things men do quite effectively. That's the exact sort of development we support. No, thank you. But you don't get the social development when it becomes an entirely different sphere, when you divert capital and visibility to one area, like women's services, that mean that you just entirely shut it off. You also don't challenge the idea that CG brought that there are stereotypical male jobs, because now there are literally female jobs, because females are the only ones allowed to have them. We thought you also had massive harm. Firstly, economic participation changed. You created fear and instant animosity amongst men who now have to compete with women. You got ideological loss because you lost the idea from third wave feminism that women could have different aims. And you got mass segregation. Even though it still exists, you entrench it far more. If that's a harm, your side gets far more of that harm. What we brought you is this. The special economic zones were likely not to function as they thought. They were going to compete with male for animosity, and that side won fight. We thought it was better to allow the market to work, to create incentives for men to change. That's how we actually got the increased stance of women we oppose.